Today we have myself, Christian Hyde. I'm a managing director at Risk 360, help oversee our privacy practice. And with us, we have privacy expert Phil Brudney. Phil, mind doing a quick intro?
Sure. Phil Brudney, also director here at Risk 360. I head up our privacy practice. I'm a fellow of information privacy with the IAPP. Glad to be here.
Awesome. So there's been some interesting developments in the world of privacy that I want to get into, but I think maybe to set the stage here, let's talk about where we are when it comes to privacy. I guess as an environment, as a business world, as a culture. So privacy's, I think, for the first time over the last 5 or 10 years, I guess you could say, becoming highly regulated. Everyone's probably very familiar with GDPR. HIPAA is a pretty old one here in the U.S. California is releasing some legislation. New York is releasing some legislation. I would argue perhaps none of it is adequate or exactly what we need. In tandem with that, we have social media companies harvesting data, a lot of headlines about privacy. We see some social media censorship, I guess you could argue, or them using some license to revoke individuals from social media platforms or news platforms. Some third parties, like the Parler thing, taking away services from platforms, perhaps because they don't agree with or because they have a good reason to, in fact, remove that access. But all of this talk of privacy and who's in control of the data, who owns the content, is starting to bubble to the surface in a way of, you could probably ask your parents what they think about privacy. And for the first time, people are starting to think about this. It's really in the public consciousness. And until now, what most regulations and what companies and the stance that most organizations have taken is saying, we're going to notify you when we want to do stuff at best, or we're just going to make a decision and in the fine print tell you that we're doing that, but they're not being responsible for your data. They're really taking action and thinking about the consequences later, which is causing some ethical issues, causing some business issues. Regulations are trying to deal with this. So what people are talking about now in the privacy space is, if we believe that data is an asset, are organizations responsible as a fiduciary to those assets? And that's what we're going to talk about today. Is this a paradigm shift in how we're going to think about privacy and data ownership and stewardship versus how we've thought about it in years past? And I think this is like a critical moment for us to start maturing that way of thinking. So can you talk a little bit about that, Phil? What is this concept of fiduciary when it comes to data, and how's that different from how organizations are thinking about it today?
Sure. I think you hit a lot of key points there. So, privacy, especially given the digital space and the pace of change there, is really a new discipline. And, to date, a lot of it has just been, as you said, notification. So getting companies to put together a good privacy notice. Generally, your regulations have shifted to, a clear, plain English kind of standard for that.
Yes, everyone's talking about the cookie consent or like the privacy notice on the website, but that is like the very surface of this problem. But
yeah, well, not only is it new, but just the volume of services that individuals are interacting with. I just read last night, they say it would take 76 days per year for you to read the privacy policy of every service that you interact with. So I think the bottom line is that approach with the privacy notice has been important. It's useful. I'm sure it's generated some good, but there's room for maturity in the privacy space, and that's where this concept of data fiduciary comes in.
So just for context, I think previously there was a couple of privacy principles, one of them being, in some instances, you have to get the individual's consent, and also that which is called consent, and the other privacy principle is notice. So if you decide to use their data in a certain way, you're supposed to notify them. That's why you get this barrage of emails. We've updated our privacy policy, or whatever that means. So that has been the stance today. It's really the burden's on you. Say, hey, you're using our service,
Exactly.
it's free, it's cheap. We're going to do with the data to monetize it, whatever we want to do with it, arguably. And if you're lucky, we might notify you. And if you're really lucky, we might put it in plain English so you can actually understand what we're trying to do. Right. So
Exactly.
that's the state we're in today. So talk a little bit about the fiduciary mindset. What is that?
hmm Sure. So the first time I'd actually seen it in print was the New York Privacy Act, which has been proposed this year for a second time. We're tracking it very closely, but it really boils everything down to business needs to do what a reasonable consumer would expect with personal data, including the use of third parties, and this should be done with primary consideration to the data subject or consumer end user, depending on the case, and ahead of consideration of the business's interest in that data.
Yeah, so about it like the way I hear fiduciary used is if you have like a financial advisor or you're giving someone responsibility to invest on your behalf, the automatic assumption is, or the thing you want to ask is, are you a fiduciary? And meaning, are you loyal to me? Do you have my best interest at heart when you're making decisions, or is there some other motive driving you? And when it comes to financial, this is a very natural thing. It's like, yes, they're always investing in your best interest. They're looking out for you. It's your asset, so they're entrusted with that asset. And now we're thinking about the same thing when it comes to privacy, because data is an asset. So if you own that asset as an individual, your data, you're giving that to a business, well, they're supposed to have your best interest at heart when they're using that data and use it as such. And, so that shouldn't require that they send you a consent or a notification that they're going to use it in some new way. There should be an approach where they're trying to do the right thing. And that comes back to how we're building privacy programs. So we talked, I think the other day about having a privacy mission statement
Mm-hmm.
and privacy core values and objectives that, just like a company would have core values and ethics that you would point back to during decision making. What's your thoughts there? How is this going to impact the business? Like maybe today I'm thinking about using data any way I can monetize it. Tomorrow I might be using data, but really thinking about how I want to use that to protect the individual and who's the right person at the individual to do that, or at the company to do that.
Yeah, exactly. I think in the governance approach for privacy, you're going to see some changes. So we've always talked about the defensible approach, making sure companies do their homework and document how they're making decisions about privacy. I think that will take a step up. So GDPR has the principle of the data protection officer, which it doesn't quite say in plain language, but is more or less the consumer's advocate within the company. And to date, for companies not strictly required to have a DPO, there's been some flexibility around how they fill that position and manage privacy. But I think really for any company now, considering who's the consumer advocate when it comes to making decisions around privacy and taking that position seriously, taking the fiduciary model to heart, as you say, around developing a mission statement and your core values around privacy. So really making sure you're fully embedding the consumer and their perspective into all of that.
I was trying to think ahead of this podcast, like if I'm an organization, why do I want to move to this model? Because it seems in some ways bad for business if I'm a big data kind of organization, because you think away a lot of these tech companies are their monetization strategy works today. At least part of it is maybe you run at a loss for a very long time. You create a great product, you harvest data because you offer the product for free, for example, in social media. And with that data, maybe you're able to do analytics and insights, and you can sell that data. Maybe you can market to individuals or advertise to them, or however you want to use that data. And that is your monetary strategy. And there's new companies every day with apps and everything else that start a business with that model in mind. And the fiduciary way of thinking seems very dangerous to that business model. So I think my pitch to those organizations, like how do I accept this business model or this new way of thinking while also, keeping my business alive? And I think the short answer is this is getting ahead of it, and and if you're early enough and you're thinking about the customer's best interests, then you can adjust your business model early enough to account for what's coming down the pipe. Because I'll bet within the next 5 years, maybe 10, but I'm thinking maybe next 5, we're going to see some regulations come out, at least at the state and local levels, that are going to have this as the test for the legally defensible approach. And how that manifests itself for organizations is if someone brings litigation to you, or a government state agency wants to audit you, the standard that you'll be held up to is, can you evidence to me that you had the data subject's best interest at heart? Show your homework. Show me how you did that. And that's when you're going to need privacy professionals who understand how to do that in line with business. So doing what's called a privacy impact assessment, doing risk assessments, doing data inventories, and building a case for you that says, look, we can make this business decision, but here are the confines in which we need to make that business decision. And that's going to be a whole new strategic perspective that doesn't exist today, because largely we can get any data we want. That technology's way far out, but we're not thinking about how we can do that and also meet regulatory requirements and do the right thing ethically as well. And also suspect that if you're already navigating HIPAA and GDPR and the whole alphabet soup of different regulatory requirements, if you approach it with the fiduciary standard, I'll bet that the rest of those will fall in line. That's the highest standard, and you're going to have like a one standard that meets them all. If you can meet that standard, then you'll automatically also be GDPR compliant and be HIPAA compliant and everything else by design, because you've thought about that. So I think there is some business value in taking this approach, because if you're future-proofing your business and you're trying to build a privacy program that's going to scale and last, and products that have business models that are going to, fall in line here, this is going to be a great approach, a necessary approach.
Yeah, one thing I've been talking a little bit about with our colleague Philip Lee is about self-regulation and privacy. So I'll be really curious looking at the principle of self-regulation along with this new concept of what companies start to band together and say, hey, we want to be privacy focused, be able to show that and gain consumer confidence that way. So I think particularly if self-regulation comes into play, then you can see business value in that way and just being the privacy-centric alternative.
Yeah, so self-regulation, essentially like no government intervention, that the industry itself is regulating itself. I think that'd be preferred, right? People, at least in the business world, would probably prefer that over a mandate. So that'd be nice. I don't have a lot of confidence that that's going to happen. I think there's too many incentives, arguably. Well, so that's exactly where this goes back to, right? You have someone at the organization that is the consumer's advocate, because I don't think it's malicious, but most organizations, I don't think, have the vocabulary quite yet to talk about privacy and to talk about the implications to the end user. They're building products, they're solving problems, some of them really good problems and innovative problems, but they can also be harmful in many ways to an individual's privacy. So when you have an absence of that voice of reason that says, hey, here's a perspective that you need to consider, then automatically, you're making potentially bad decisions. So what do you think we're going to do about that? Like, what's the next wave? How do you get the right people at the table to have the conversations with the engineering team, the strategy folks, the CEOs to say, hey, look, privacy is a concern. You need to think of it in this way. Because I see the same thing in security, right? Like, we're just now getting where there's a chief information security officer, and there's still many problems with security. So what do you think the path forward to get a privacy person at the table is?
That's a great question. So one thing that we typically do is we set up a data protection office similar to how we run information risk councils with our clients. So that's the primary governing body with a cross-functional representation to look at privacy on an ongoing basis. And to really get to this next step, I'd go back to what we talked about earlier, setting a mission statement, core values, and really thinking about are we prepared for this approach to privacy? Is this something we believe in? You know, you can have a regulation about something, but you might not believe in it. But to your point, there should be value in actually adopting it, internalizing it, and making it forefront for your company. So I think taking that governance approach, but making sure you have a well-defined leader for privacy and defining what your strategy should be.
Yeah, I mean, I think for most of our clients, I can genuinely say they want to do the right thing. Like they might not have had the time or the vocabulary to think about this problem in a certain way, but they want to do the right thing. But the way this manifests itself for most of our clients that I'm working with is they're overburdened with regulations, HIPAA, GDPR, you name it, there's a lot of them. And they want to naturally handle those in a whack-a-mole approach. So GDPR lives in this silo, HIPAA lives in this silo, California Privacy Rights Act over here. They come up at different times for different reasons, but they just want to know it's handled. And what they don't necessarily see is that there's a Venn diagram here. All these privacy regulations are overlap in many ways. And if you can bring an approach to the table that harmonizes all of those different regulations, you can gain a lot of efficiency and a lot of business value. So in my mind, this is where this fiduciary thing could be a game changer. Because if I have to comply with all of that anyway, and privacy is part of what I need to do as a business model, I can take the highest standard and develop a privacy program that what falls out is compliance with all of these other regulations. And that's exactly where that governance structure that you're talking about comes in, because you got to get the right leaders at the table to make those decisions. So in security, we call it an information risk council. In privacy, we also often call it a data protection office. You can call it whatever you want, but you get the right people at the table on a periodic basis with the right data points in front of them, ready to make decisions, so they can govern those programs, roll out policies, decide, make product development, R&D decisions, understand what regulations they need to comply with. But it just feels like doing business. And you're complying with all these requirements, but if you do it right, you're escalating it to leaders, or they're just doing business and compliance falls out of it. And I like that fiduciary standard because I feel like that's a weapon or a tool that compliance folks like me and you can bring to the table and say, this is the way we need to be thinking about it. But out of that, it's going to follow your compliance requirements. And by the way, it's going to be a lot more efficient for your business than whack-a-moling all these different regulations. So that's how I'm hoping to help use this. Well, also back of my mind, it's the ethical thing to do. It's the right thing to do. It's future-proofing the business. It's scalable. It's all the things you want to bring business value in a compliance conversation. So how far off do you think we are from regulation that kind of uses this term? I know New York's already using some of it. Where do you think we're at with that?
Yeah, as far as New York, it's been proposed. It's working its way through their legislative process. I don't have a good feel for how long it might be, but I think there's always the copycat effect. So other jurisdictions looking at this say, hey, it's the right thing. But to the more broader point, as we're talking about just what an evolution of privacy looks like, GDPR was the first wave, set a lot of principles, but I think some of the larger organizations and market leaders are really starting to really think about getting to this standard already, the data fiduciary standard, and what that will look like. So I think New York's the one specific piece, but more broadly, I think it's just where the market's headed.
Yep. What do you think? So one thing I'm thinking about is there's a little bit of a shortage of privacy professionals out there. This is a new phenomenon. People are getting up to speed. There's not a lot of privacy experts relative to market need. And also privacy today, I feel like is largely driven by regulatory requirements. So you have attorneys or compliance experts that are brought in to solve a regulatory problem, not an ethical problem, not a business model problem, not a strategic problem, but no, I have a compliance need. I need to understand that need. I need to get through it. What do you think? Do you have any sense for what is it going to take to elevate the current batch of privacy professionals to the next step where they're helping make strategic decisions? Not just being at the table, but like a mindset or a skill set gap. Do you have any sense for where we're at there? That's a hard one.
It's another really good question. Yeah. Because I think, always one thing that I feel is a bit underlooked in privacy is, especially in the field we're in, is security and IT. So really being able to understand the system. Now you're talking about bringing in really a solid business understanding. How do you make the business case to the stakeholders, explain why they should do this that might harm their business in the short term. So I think for privacy professionals, that's probably going to be an additional challenge. But the more you sit at the table, the more you learn. So, but pushing in that direction, just seeing how the organization is making decisions, will go a long way.
Part of the conversations that we always have is when it comes to security or privacy, this isn't a security and privacy problem. This is an organizational change problem. Like, you have to educate the right individuals. You have to have the right communication plan. You have to disseminate information appropriately. You have to be able to tie these security and compliance problems back to business problems so people care about them and give them the time that they deserve. So part of me wonders if this is a vocabulary problem. Like, we got to give those strategic decision makers, the product owners, the innovative CEOs, the folks out there building companies, a way of thinking where privacy is at least part of the puzzle for them. You know what I mean? This is like almost a cultural thing that we have to do. Maybe it's in the education system. Maybe it's part of business training. I mean, we have ethics when it comes to business school. So maybe privacy needs to become a bigger and bigger part of that. So people have the brain to think about it. They have the words to use to articulate the feelings they have about wanting to be private into the products that they're building. Because right now it's just so attractive to build a free app that harvests data, or to build a company and monetize on the back end with data. And I can say a few years ago, I wouldn't have been malicious, but I would have been okay with building a product perhaps that used data in a way that today I have a more mature understanding of. And that's because I have new vocabulary to talk about it. So I don't know, like, is this like an elementary school thing? You got to educate folks. You got to help them understand the value of privacy, because it is a core tenet of life. You need it, at least in my opinion. But getting those strategic decision makers is something I've been thinking about. Like, for us, when we're at clients and we're educating individuals on this regulation or that regulation, or we're doing an orientation session, maybe part of that needs to say, hey, look, this is what's going on in the privacy world, and here's the vocabulary and the discussions that are being had, because it's interesting. Like, security is a little bit ethereal. You think of big companies having a security breach more so than anything, whereas privacy is very real. It sits with you. It's like your privacy. It's how your data is being used. You can look at any app on your phone and see how they're using it. I think unlike security, I think privacy has the opportunity to be on the forefront of people's mind because it's so personal, which is a very unique thing in the compliance universe. Most of the stuff's off that suit. It lives in the tax code or some regulation, but privacy is very personal, which makes it interesting and fun to work with.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think you're onto it. Just educating people and building out the vocabulary around how we discuss it. That'll be a key piece to really bring all this to bear.
Yeah, I do want to talk about a few things that we've seen. I think it's interesting. We're very fortunate. I almost think that we take it for granted sometimes, just how much we get to see when it comes to privacy, what companies are doing. So I wanted to talk a little bit about, maybe spend 5 minutes on this, Phil, is like apps. How are apps using your data on the phone? automated decision making when it comes to finance and lending, like some of those cool use cases. Do you mind just throwing out like one or two? I'd love to get those out there and say, hey, look, folks, this is in your life and it makes a difference. You need to know about it. So maybe like just starting with the phone, can you just rattle off like how is this being used?
Yeah. So one thing that's been getting a good bit of play is WhatsApp. I think they made a change to their privacy policy that really threw up a lot of red flags for consumers. Really anything. I think we're so used to giving apps access to our entire contact list without much of an understanding of how that's actually being used. So, it's one thing to go into an app and say, okay, I'll give you access to my contacts. I want to connect with them real quickly. It's another if the company is then turning around and skimming all that data, doing something different with that.
Yeah,
So I
I mean
think
that's
that's one thing.
fiduciary, right?
Hmm.
It's like, do you have Phil Brudney's best interest at heart? Okay, I'm using a running app. I'm gonna spin it up and they ask for everything on my phone. It's like, well, maybe you need my GPS, maybe you need some geolocation so you can track my runs, but do you really need my access to my email? I'm not saying they're doing that, but like that'd be an example.
Yeah.
But if you can have it as a fiduciary, you're like, you don't need that access cell phone app. Like, there's no reason to have that. You have my best interest at heart.
Yeah.
But yeah,
I do think that the way apps have to present the data they're getting access to helps consumers gain more awareness of how data is being used. Microphone is a big thing. Um, I'm sure we've all experienced Instagram and Facebook always seem to be listening. You get all kinds of ads based on stuff that it seems your phone has heard you talk about.
yeah,
Um, so I think consumers are gaining a lot more awareness there.
yeah. It was my daughter's seventh birthday a while back, and I've been getting a bunch of Amazon like recommendations for like a balloon party stuff for 7-year-olds, not just birthday stuff, but for 7-year-olds. And I'm like, there's no way. Like, how do you know this? I haven't bought
Yeah.
anything, anything weird. So
Yeah.
stuff like you gotta wonder. The other thing that I'm always thinking of it in the apps is people aren't aware of just how much they collect, like accelerometer. So they know if you're in your car or if you're stopped, elevation, barometer information, they know where you are. You can look at your map data and you can look at this is on iPhones and most smartphones. And if you look at that map, it's pretty obvious where you live and where you work. Because you go a lot of other places a little bit, but there's a huge red dot at home and at work. So they can collect really interesting information. Also, who your best friend is. Maybe you guys meet up and do a run every day. Maybe whatever you can make some really interesting assumptions about an individual based on where they shop, their buying habits, do they exercise, where do they live, and that information combined with a lot of other data can be used to violate your privacy in one form or another. So I've always heard the phrase that if something's free, you are the product. That's
Very true.
a bit of cynicism that's fallen out of this whole privacy situation that's important. Apple just made an update, I think, to like 14.4 that's going to empower the user to deny more and more of those services or more customization, which you ask yourself, why now? Why not 2 years ago? But it's good that they're doing that. But a lot of changes. So that's kind of apps. The other thing that we've run into is automated decision making, which is big in GDPR, but not touched anywhere else really. Like,
Yeah.
I get a bit frustrated when I hear privacy professionals like really pound on like cookie consent and like, do you have a privacy policy on your website? Because for me, that's like the surface. That's some of the least valuable stuff. While important, it's not like where the meat is, the stuff that really matters. And what really matters is how people are using this data like we just talked about and automated decision making. So can you talk a little bit about that, Phil? Like, what is automated decision making? Have you seen it out in the wild?
Yeah, so automated decision making usually tracks closely with profiling, but it's really anytime that a computer is piecing together multiple pieces of information to try to make a decision about you.
Yeah.
Um, So, it particularly when data is coming in from multiple sources, these machines can make some very interesting decisions about you as far as what ads you're served. We certainly see it out out in the field for credit and underwriting decisions, and really, when you think about the data that's coming together to make that decision, it can be pretty eye-opening for an individual.
One thing that's crazy to me about the future is there's this phenomena of automated decision making. We've seen it in comment moderation and social media, which is good, arguably, because there's no way you have enough humans in the world to do this because so much content's generated. You see it in the lending space. So, like, are you approved for a loan or not approved for credit? So a lot of that's automated or semi-automated. But where we're bubbling up to is some of these algorithms are making decisions themselves, or they're adjusting the algorithm themselves. So, for example, if you're strictly data and you're looking at credit decisioning, well, maybe you have to be very careful about that because you might inadvertently discriminate against a certain group. So those manual activities have to be overwritten, have to be underwritten by humans and overwritten. We've seen that in the field,
Yep.
which is a really interesting use case in automated decision making. And I just wonder where this is going, because we're talking about the fiduciary model, where you have to have the person's best interest at heart. And then we compound that with machine learning and artificial intelligence and the use of algorithms and automated decision making to do this. And can you ask an algorithm to have an individual's best interest at heart? And can an engineer even program an algorithm to do that? Because I've read recently that, like, the YouTube algorithms and some of the Google search, that there's no group of engineers that really even understand the entirety of how that works, because turnover has been developed over 20 years, plus machine learning it's starting to make its own stuff. So that's a really weird sci-fi way to look at this, is like, can we even take our privacy back at that level, or do you have to start over? So I don't know, there's no answer there for me, but it's an interesting exercise. I'm going to end it at that.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for joining, man. This is an awesome conversation. I know there's a lot more to come. Like, everybody cares about privacy. This is an awesome place to be. So thanks for lending your expertise.
Thanks, Christian. Enjoyed it.